He built a cabin inside a fallen giant tree and never got cold again. David Miller was 42 years old, 15 of them dedicated to a piece of land he swore up and down was his. In a winter that arrived earlier than anyone expected, he found himself walking down a dirt road covered in snow with a backpack on his shoulders and absolutely nothing else in the world. No home, no income, no place to go. It was during this aimless walk that he first spotted the trunk. It was immense, bigger than anything David had ever seen in his life, lying on the snow as if it had always been there waiting for someone. A tree that time had knocked down so many years ago that the inside had already started to rot, opening up space where there had once been only solid wood. David stopped in front of that gigantic trunk and stared at it for a length of time he himself couldn't measure. And it was there, in the middle of the biting cold on his face, that an idea flashed through his head like a bolt of lightning on a summer afternoon. But to understand what led David to that road, with that backpack and that look of someone who had lost everything, you have to go back a few weeks. The property where he had lived since he was 27 was set back in the Appalachian Mountains, a small community where everyone knew everyone by their first name, and where news arrived slowly but never failed to show up. It was a land of tall pines, heavy frosts, and people of few words. David fit perfectly into that place because he himself was like that, closed off on the outside, steady on the inside, and completely incapable of asking for help even when he was sinking. He had taken over the property along with Richard Harrison, a businessman who had shown up years ago with a wide smile and a proposal that seemed too good to be true. Richard had the money that David didn't, and David had the land and the labor that Richard needed. The lease contract was signed on a sunny afternoon, with a handshake and everything in David's kitchen. For years, things worked, until David got sick. It wasn't a serious illness, but it was a long one. An infection that got complicated, required hospitalization, and took him away from the fields for almost 5 months. And it was during those 5 months that Richard made his move. When David returned, thinner and quieter than when he had left, the first signs were too subtle for him to notice right away. Richard was more present than usual, more accommodating, always ready with an explanation for any question. But it was on an afternoon in April, when David went to the county clerk's office in the nearby town to take care of a simple matter, that the ground disappeared beneath his feet. The clerk, a young man who clearly didn't know who David was, pointed to the document on the computer screen with a neutral expression and said that property had been registered for 3 months under Richard Harrison's name. Entirely. No division. No exceptions. As if David had never existed. He left the office without saying a word, got in the car, sat staring at the steering wheel for over an hour, and then he went straight to confront Richard. The confrontation was worse than any fight David had ever had in his life, not because of the volume of the voices, but because of what was revealed. Richard didn't deny it. He stayed calm, almost bored, and said that the original documents had been corrected during the period David was incapacitated, and that there were witnesses, there were signatures, there was a process that had already been formally concluded, and there was also an eviction notice that David received right there in that moment with a 15-day deadline. David looked at that paper, looked at Richard, and then he turned his back and walked away without saying a single word. Those 15 days were the longest of David's life. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat right. He sat on the porch of the house that would soon no longer be his, staring at the trees he had planted himself, at the fence he had fixed dozens of times, at the well he had helped dig with his own hands on a summer afternoon 15 years ago. And he didn't care about anyone. He had a daughter, Chloe, 18 years old, living in another city where she was in her 2nd year of a university she had earned through hard work. Their relationship had soured precisely because of Richard. Chloe had never liked the man, never trusted him, and had told her father so countless times with a clarity that deeply irritated David. He thought his daughter was being immature, that she didn't understand business, that she was too young to judge a man he had known for years. The arguments became more frequent and more serious, until one cold Sunday in January, Chloe had packed her bags and left, and the two had exchanged nothing more than short, cold messages since. Now, on the 15th day before being evicted from his own life, David picked up his phone 3 times to call her. and all 3 times he put the phone back in his pocket without dialing. Pride weighed more than longing. Or perhaps pride was just the way he had found to keep longing from showing up. On the last day, he packed what fit into a worn-out backpack, a change of clothes, an old blanket, a small axe that had belonged to his father, a utility knife, some rusty nails that were inside a can in the garage, and he left. He simply left. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and hit like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, moving on. He walked along the dirt road for almost 2 hours before stopping in front of the trunk. The trunk was on a stretch of road he knew well, on a piece of land that seemed to belong to no one in particular, between the boundaries of 2 properties whose owners never seemed to care about that strip of land. The tree that formed that trunk was of a species no longer seen in those parts, one of the last of its kind, and it had fallen no one knew exactly when. It had been long enough for the inside to be partially hollow, with the rotten wood giving way at a touch, and it had been recent enough for the outer bark to still be intact, thick and tough, like the walls of an old building. David stood before that trunk with the cold cutting across the side of his face and the snow softening under his boots. He slapped a hand flat against the bark. It was solid. It was firm. He walked along its length, calculating with his eyes, running his fingers through the natural cracks that time had opened. He reached the end where the rotten wood had created an opening wide enough for a person to crouch and enter, and then he bent down and went inside. Inside, it smelled of dampness and old earth. The light coming in through the cracks drew thin stripes on the floor of rotted wood. David stood in the center of that curved space, his head almost touching the ceiling of the trunk, looking at the dark wooden walls around him, and for a moment he didn't feel the cold. That night, he slept inside the trunk wrapped in the old blanket. The next morning he woke up with his body aching and his breath condensing in the cold air, but with his head strangely clear. He came out of the trunk, stood looking at it from the outside for a long time, and then he went to get the axe from the backpack. The work started slowly. David first removed the rotten pieces of wood from the inside with his bare hands, tossing everything out. Then he used the axe to widen the entrance opening, to level the uneven floor, to remove roots that had grown inside. His hands cracked from the cold in the first few days. His fingers grew so stiff that he had to warm them in his mouth before continuing. But he didn't stop. Mrs. Martha Sullivan, a 71-year-old woman who lived on a small property less than 300 yards from there, began watching the commotion from the very first day. She knew that road like the back of her hand, and she knew that tree stump had always been there, but she had never seen anyone approach it with an axe and such determination. She watched from the window for 2 days before stepping outside. Martha had completely white hair, cut short, and carried her years with the posture of someone who hadn't bent easily through life. She had been widowed young, raised 2 children alone on that same property, and spent the last decades in a peaceful silence she had chosen herself. She was a woman of very few words, but when she spoke, what came out carried weight. She approached the stump one afternoon when David Miller was removing a chunk of rotten wood that had resisted his hands and was now yielding to the axe. She stood watching without saying anything for a moment. "Are you going to build something in there?" she finally asked. David stopped. He looked at the woman over his shoulder with an expression that was not hostile but not open either. "I'm building," he said curtly. "To live in?" "For now." Martha stood silent for another moment, assessing. Then she nodded, as if that were enough information, and went back home without further questions. 3 days later, there was a bag hanging at the entrance of the stump when David returned from a walk to a nearby creek where he fetched water. Inside the bag, a lunchbox with beef stew and biscuits still warm, wrapped in a dish towel to keep the heat in. No note, no explanation. He grabbed the bag, stared at it, and hung it back exactly where it had been. The next morning, the bag was still there. And David had slept on an empty stomach. He returned it untouched for 2 more days. On the 4th day, he woke up with a weakness in his arms that wasn't just from the physical strain. He took the bag, opened the lunchbox, and ate, sitting on the floor inside the stump, with his head down and his eyes fixed on nothing. The food was cold, but it was food. and it was the first decent thing to enter his body in days. That night he lay awake for a long time, thinking about who he was, a man who needed help from an old woman who didn't even know his name. As the inside of the stump took shape, the world outside caught fire in the way small communities do, with whispers that turned into rumors, that turned into gossip, that turned into scandal. The first to appear was a group of men working on construction in the area. They drove by on the road in a pickup truck, saw David installing a makeshift wooden support inside the stump, and stopped. One of them got out of the car with his cell phone and took a picture without asking. Another shouted something that David didn't bother to answer. And the photo ended up in messaging app groups of that small community, with a caption saying something about the man who lost his farm and went to live inside a tree. Within 2 days, everyone in the region knew the story, or at least the version that photo told, which was of a broken man, humiliated, reduced to that. Richard Harrison saw the photo in a group he was part of. He looked at the image for a while and felt a satisfaction he wouldn't have admitted out loud to anyone. David was finished. He was publicly humiliated. He was living inside a tree like an animal. The property was his, the lawsuit was closed, and the only problem that still nagged was David's physical presence in that region, because David's presence was a reminder, and reminders were dangerous. So Richard took an action that he thought was smart at the time, but which would later prove to be the biggest mistake of his life. He went to a local representative to make an informal complaint that David was illegally occupying an area near the property line. It wasn't true. The tree trunk was on a strip of land that had nothing to do with the disputed property. But Richard counted on the confusion and the rush, and for a few days it worked. David received an informal warning from a neighbor that Richard had contacted, saying there was pressure for him to leave the area. David was silent for a long moment after hearing the warning. Then he went for his axe, and he sped up the construction. Chloe Miller was sitting on the bed of the apartment she shared with a roommate when her father's picture appeared in a student group she was part of, sent by someone from her town who had relatives in the Appalachian Mountains. The message with the picture was curious, slightly mocking, the kind people share without thinking about the weight they carry. But Chloe didn't see a curious story. She saw the boots, the green coat worn at the shoulder seams, the same one her father had worn for as long as she could remember, the stooped but steady posture of a man who would never let himself be photographed with an expression of defeat, even if he was living inside a tree. She stared at that image for a time she couldn't measure, and then she dialed her father's number without thinking further. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. "David Miller," he said, as if it were a business call, with his voice completely controlled. "Dad," Chloe said, and that was all. There was a silence. "Chloe," his voice changed slightly, got a little lower. "You okay?" "I saw the picture." Another silence. Longer. "What picture?" "Dad." "I'm fine," he said right away. "It's temporary. I'm sorting things out." "You're living inside a tree." "I'm building a shelter. There's a difference." Chloe closed her eyes. She recognized that tone. It was the tone he used when he didn't want to continue a conversation, when he was building a wall brick by brick with his own words. "You need help, Dad." "I'm fine," he repeated. "Don't worry." "But I am worried." "Go study, Chloe. You have class tomorrow." And he hung up. Chloe stared at the phone in her hand. She took a deep breath. And then she opened her phone's browser and started searching for information about rural lease disputes. She wasn't going to wait for her father to ask for help, because she knew that day would never come. In the following days, the construction inside the trunk progressed in a way that even surprised David himself. He had a skill with his hands that he had never quite put into those terms, but that had always been there, honed by 15 years of field work where breaking down wasn't an option. With pieces of wood he found discarded in 2 different places along the road, he improvised a low bed that sat a few inches above the trunk's floor. With stones collected from a nearby embankment, he built a base for a makeshift stove that sat at the back of the trunk, with an opening for a chimney that he made through the wood at the top, with patience and a lot of effort. The chimney was an old metal pipe he found partially buried on the side of the road. It was rusty on the outside, but still serviceable. It went over the trunk and was visible from above like a small functional flag. When the stove fire was lit for the first time, and the smoke rose up through that makeshift pipe instead of filling the inside of the trunk, David stared at that smoke coming out up there and felt something he couldn't quite name. It was almost pride. But deeper than that. With the clay he fetched from a more distant creek bank, he sealed the cracks in the wood where the cold came in. He mixed the clay with dry straw and compacted leaves to give it more thickness. The work was slow and got harder when his fingers grew cold too quickly, but the temperature difference inside the trunk became noticeable day by day. On the first night the stove worked properly, with a steady fire and the chimney pulling the smoke outside. David lay down on the wooden bed with his blanket and listened to the wind hitting the thick bark of the trunk out there. The sound was different from inside, muffled, distant, as if the world had moved to the other side of a thick wall, and he was left here warm, separated from the cold by that wood that time had made sturdy. He slept for 8 straight hours, for the first time in weeks. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers. Now continuing. The community kept talking. The photos kept circulating. And with every new share, Richard read the comments carefully, gauging the tone. For now the tone was one of curiosity and mockery, and that suited him fine. But here and there, a comment from the older locals carried a different weight. Comments that spoke of injustice, that asked what had happened to that man for him to end up like that. Those comments Richard deleted from the group where he had admin access. What he couldn't erase was people's memory. And in that community, the memory of the older folks was as long and deep as the roots of those trees. Mrs. Martha knew things that most of the younger residents never imagined existed. She was 71 years old, having lived her whole life in that same region, and her memory was one of those that doesn't lose detail over time, but gains layers. She knew who had built what, who had sold what to whom, who had made deals that were never put on paper, and who had suffered the consequences of those deals decades later. And she knew who David Miller's father was. George Miller had also been a local man, deceased for over 20 years, a man who had worked that land his whole life with honesty, and who, in his final years, had been caught up in a story of deals that never became clear to anyone. The property he was going to leave to his son was never legally registered in David's name because George passed away before completing the process, and the paperwork ended up in a grey area that no one resolved. Martha had watched that situation from afar and never got involved because it wasn't her business. But what she knew, and now considered relevant, was that the strip of land where the giant trunk was located had never been legally transferred to anyone. It rightfully belonged to George Miller's inheritance, which meant it rightfully belonged to David. On an afternoon when the sun appeared between the clouds for a few hours and the cold eased up a bit, Martha went to the trunk with a cup of hot coffee and sat on a smaller piece of log that David had placed outside as a makeshift bench. He was working at the door, fitting a wooden plank he had found and sawed to the right size. He heard her approach, glanced over his shoulder and kept working. "Do you know who your father was?" she asked after a while. "I know who my father was," he replied, without pausing. "Not as a son. As a son, everyone knows. I'm asking if you know who he was around here." David stopped, looked at her. "George Miller," he said, "worked the land. Died when I was 20. "He worked this land," Martha said, making a slow gesture with her hand that encompassed the area around them. "This stretch right here, this piece of road, that tree house you're building." David looked at her fixedly for a moment. "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that piece of land never left your father's family. There was never a legal transfer. Richard Harrison might have taken the property, but this strip here he never touched because he probably doesn't even know it exists the way it does." There was a heavy silence. The wind stirred the branches up above. "How do you know that?" David asked, his voice careful. "Because I was here when your father was alive, and because old people keep things that young people think don't matter." She said this without arrogance, just as a fact. David stared at the treetops. There was something growing inside his chest that he wasn't quite sure how to name. It wasn't exactly hope. It was something more delicate and more dangerous than hope. It was the possibility that things weren't completely lost. "Does this change anything?" he asked cautiously. "Does it change anything on paper?" "It might," Martha said. "Depends on who looks at the right paper." She finished her coffee, stood up slowly, and left without further explanation. She left the empty cup on the makeshift bench as if she knew she'd come back for it later. David stared at the cup for a long moment. Then he went into the treehouse, sat on the wooden bed, and kept thinking until the fire in the stove died down. The next day, he went to the county clerk's office in town. The county clerk's office was on a paved downtown street in an old two-story building that smelled of paper and varnish. David walked in with his backpack on, as always, with a beard grown out over days that he still hadn't managed to shave properly, and asked for access to old land registration documents from the region. The clerk who helped him was friendly and efficient, and brought out a series of physical folders, in addition to checking an old digitized system covering the more recent records. David spent hours flipping through documents. His search was for his father's name, for any record linking George Miller to that specific strip of land. And he found it. It wasn't easy to find. It was buried among other records from an era when boundaries were marked more informally, but it was there, a possession note dated decades ago, registered in George Miller's name with a description of boundaries that clearly included the area where the treehouse was located. The transfer of that area never happened. There was no document transferring that strip to any other name, which meant that legally it still belonged to George Miller's estate. David left the clerk's office with copies the clerk made for him. He stood outside on the sidewalk with the light snow that had started falling, holding those papers in both hands as if they were fragile. They were important. They were the first concrete thing he had in his hands. But he knew that paper without a lawyer was paper without power. And a lawyer cost money he didn't have. He went back to the treehouse without telling anyone. He stored the documents in a dry part of the treehouse, rolled up in some plastic he had found days earlier, and he spent the night staring at the curved wooden ceiling above his head, thinking. Chloe had done her own research that week. She called the number of a lawyer she found recommended in an online forum about rural issues, a professional named James Patterson, who worked on inheritance and lease disputes in the Appalachian Mountains. The call was cautious, exploratory, with no commitment from either side. Chloe explained the situation in broad terms, without giving names, and without revealing she was speaking about her own family. James listened carefully, and said that if what she was describing was true, there was a basis to challenge both the eviction and the falsified documents. He asked for documents. He asked for original records. And he said something that stayed in Chloe Miller's mind for days afterward, that the key to cases like this in general was in the oldest records, not the most recent ones. She thought about calling her father, but she knew that if she called, he would probably say he was fine and hang up. So she made a different decision. She asked for a week of excused absence from the university, gathered the money she had saved from her side gigs over the last few months, bought a bus ticket, and went to the closest town to the Appalachian Mountains where her father was staying. She arrived on a day of thick fog that made the surrounding pines look like shadows of themselves. She hitched a ride from the town to the main road and walked the rest of the way, dragging a small suitcase with wheels that kept jamming on the uneven dirt road. Before reaching the trunk house, she stopped at Mrs. Martha Sullivan's property. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because Martha was the only name she had managed to connect to the area when she searched for her father online. Maybe because she felt she needed some information before facing that meeting. She knocked on the door. The door opened after a few seconds. Martha looked at the young woman with dark hair and tired eyes standing at her doorstep, sizing her up. "You're George Miller's daughter," she said without hesitation. Chloe was surprised. "How do you know?" "The eyes," said Martha. "Just like your father's. Come in." Inside the small warm kitchen, while Martha put water on for hot apple cider, the two of them talked for the first time. Chloe told her what she knew about the situation. Martha told her what she knew about the land. And when Chloe mentioned that she had the contact of a lawyer who could help, Martha placed her mug on the table with a gentle firmness and said, "So we already have what we need. You have the lawyer, your father has the documents from the county clerk's office, and I have the memory of everything that happened here 40 years ago." Chloe looked at the elderly woman sitting across the table. "Would you be willing to talk to the lawyer?" "I am willing," said Martha. "As long as someone explains to me why it took so long." Chloe smiled for the first time in days, and Martha smiled too, with that smile of someone who has held on to patience for a long time and finally sees a reason to spend it. But before any lawyer, there was a conversation that needed to happen. Chloe arrived at the trunk house at the end of a late afternoon with low fog. She stood in front of that structure for a long moment, looking at the chimney rising from the top of the trunk with thin, steady smoke, at the neatly stacked pile of firewood to the left, at the wooden door fitted into the opening with a precision she hadn't expected. She recognized her father's care in every detail, the way he had stacked the firewood in straight rows, the way the door was aligned. He never did anything halfway. When the door opened from the inside and her father appeared in his green coat and full beard, the two of them stared at each other in a silence that lasted longer than any words they could have said. George Miller looked at her with an expression he tried to keep neutral but couldn't. There was something in his eyes that gave way, just a little, towards someone tired of holding everything together alone. "Chloe," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Dad," she replied, and walked in without waiting for an invitation. She stood inside the trunk looking around, at the wooden bed, at the makeshift stove with a fire that heated the space with surprising efficiency, at the clay wall sealing the cracks, at the small wooden hook on the wall where the spare coat hung. "You've always been the most stubborn man I've ever known," she said finally, her voice breaking at the end. "And you've always been the bravest," he replied. And then she turned to him and he opened his arms without ceremony, and the hug that followed was the longest the two had shared since she was 12 and had fallen off her bike and cried into her father's neck for what felt like an endless time. When they pulled apart, they were silent for a moment. David went to get the cup that Martha had left the day before and filled it with water he heated on the stove. He had no coffee, but there was hot apple cider he had gotten in a trade with a passerby. It was what he had. "We need to talk about Richard," said Chloe, sitting on the wooden bed with the cup between her hands. "I already know what you're going to say." "No, you don't. You're going to say I need a lawyer." "I already have one," she said. David stopped. "What do you mean?" "I found a lawyer who works with rural inheritance cases. I talked to him. He says there's a basis to challenge everything Richard did, but he needs the right documents." She paused. "And I know you went to the county clerk's office." He looked at her for a long moment. "How do you know that?" "Mrs. Martha told me she suggested you go." Silence. "You went to talk to her before coming here?" "I did." David got up, walked to the door and stood with his back to her, looking out at the snow. Chloe waited. "I have copies of the documents," he said finally, his voice coming out slow like something heavy. "They're stored here." "Then give me the copies," she said. "I'll take them to James. He'll know what to do with them." Another silence. "This process is going to cost money, Chloe." "I know." "Money I don't have." "I know, Dad. I don't have much either, but I have enough to get started. And James said that depending on what the documents show, he might work for a share of the payment after the case is resolved." David turned to her. There was an expression on his face she had seen very few times in her life, an expression he didn't like to show. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know I don't have to, but I want to. Chloe." "Dad." Her voice was firm, without anger, but leaving no room for argument. "I warned you about Richard. You didn't listen. I'm not saying this to hurt you, I'm saying it because it's true, and now I can help, and you're going to let me help because it's the right thing to do, okay?" David looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded. It was the first time in his whole life he accepted help without fighting it. Chloe took the copies of the documents from the county clerk's office to James Patterson the next day. The lawyer was a man in his 50s, with a simple office in a town an hour away, and he analyzed the material with an attention that Chloe found reassuring. He didn't promise anything with big words. He just said there was something real there to work with. What he needed, besides the records from the county clerk's office, was a testimony from someone with direct knowledge of the previous agreements, someone who had seen, heard, or taken part in some way in the events involving George Miller's land decades ago. Chloe already knew who that person was. Martha went to James's office on a Wednesday morning, sitting in the back seat of Chloe's car with her wool coat buttoned up to her neck and a small bag on her lap. She wasn't nervous. She was serious. She told what she knew. She told it with a precision of dates that even surprised the lawyer. She remembered the year George Miller had filed the land registry. She remembered conversations that had happened at the local general store decades ago, where the older men used to discuss land deals over coffee. She remembered names, details. James listened and took notes. At the end of the meeting, he looked at the two women sitting across the table and said, "With this, and with the documents from the county clerk's office, we have a solid foundation. It's not a guarantee, but it's solid groundwork." "How long will it take?" asked Chloe. "Cases like this can take a while, but there's another thing that could speed things up a lot. If there's an additional witness besides Mrs. Martha, someone who knew George Miller directly and can confirm the connection between him and that land." The two women exchanged a glance. "I'll think about it," said Martha. And she did. Meanwhile, Richard found out through other channels that someone had been at the county clerk's office asking for old documents. He didn't know who, but he knew it wasn't a coincidence. And he knew the only person who had a reason to dig through those files was David, or someone David had sent. It made him uneasy in a way he hadn't expected, because the story he had built depended on David staying broke, isolated, and without the resources to fight back. A David with documents and support was a whole different problem. He made a decision that revealed more about his character than any previous action. He went to Martha's property. It was a bitterly cold afternoon when Richard's pickup pulled up in front of her house. He got out, knocked on the gate, and when Martha opened the window to see who it was, he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I need to talk to you, Mrs. Martha." "I'm busy," she said. "It won't take long. It's about David Miller." "What about him?" "You're getting involved in something that isn't your business," said Richard, and the smile had vanished. "And that can create unnecessary complications for a woman your age." Martha stared at him for a long moment. "Are you threatening me, boy?" "I'm giving you advice." "I take advice," she said with a calm that visibly unsettled Richard. "But only from people who respect their elders, and you're clearly not that kind of person." She closed the window. Richard stood there in the cold for a moment, not knowing what to do with that response. Then he got back in his pickup and drove off. The problem was that there were two neighbors on the sidewalk across the street who had seen everything, and the story of how Richard Harrison had gone to intimidate Mrs. Martha was spreading through the community before the end of that afternoon. When David found out, something inside him that had been controlled got loose. He grabbed his green jacket, left his trailer, and walked to Martha's house. He knocked on the door. When she opened it, he went straight in, walked to the kitchen chair, sat down, and rested his elbows on his knees with his head in his hands. Martha didn't say anything. She went to the stove, heated a pot of soup that was left over from lunch, and set it on the table in front of him. David looked at the soup. Then he looked at the old woman sitting on the opposite side of the table with her hands folded, waiting, and then he cried. It was a quiet cry, without noise, his shoulders shaking slightly. The kind of cry from someone who has held too much in for too long and finally finds no room left to store it. Martha didn't move. She didn't say anything. She let it happen with the serenity of someone who has seen a lot in the world and knows there are moments when the most useful thing you can do for someone is simply to be there. When it stopped, David stared at the soup for a moment. Then he said, his voice hoarse, "He came here because of me." "He came here because he's scared," said Martha. "Scared people do stupid things. He shouldn't have dragged you into this." "I dragged myself in," she said, firmly but without harshness. "You didn't ask me for anything. I did it because I wanted to. And I'll keep doing it because I want to. Now eat that soup before it gets cold." David ate. And that night, when he went back to his trailer, he was a different man than the one who had left it. Not because the problem had gone away. The problem was exactly where it had always been, but something inside him had shifted, had settled in another way. The pride that had once been a wall had turned into something else, something more like determination than stubbornness. There was a subtle difference between the two, and he was only now realizing it. Right then and there, he decided he wasn't going to act alone anymore. He was going to trust Chloe. He was going to trust Martha. He was going to trust James, whom he had never met in person but whom his daughter had chosen carefully. It wasn't surrender. It was strategy. In the following days, the legal process began to take real shape. James formally filed the copies of the documents from the county clerk's office, initiated the proceedings to challenge the eviction based on the irregularities in the transfer, and requested that Martha formalize her testimony in a notarized document. What they all needed, and still didn't have, was a second witness. Martha, for her part, had someone in mind. A man named Arthur Jenkins, who was 78 years old and lived in seclusion on a small property nearly 12 miles away. Arthur was the kind of person most younger folks didn't even know existed, because he didn't use a cell phone, wasn't part of any groups, and rarely left his house. But Martha knew that he had known George Miller since they were young. She knew they had worked together for a few years in the Appalachian Mountains, right around the time the land deals took place. She asked Chloe to take her there. The visit to old Arthur was one of the strangest and most important scenes in this whole story. He opened the door of the house after 3 knocks, looked at the two of them with suspicion, and stood there for a long moment before letting them in. The house smelled of old wood and brewed coffee. There were photos on the walls that seemed to have been taken in different decades, and Chloe scanned them for a face she recognized. She found one. In one of the photos, there were 2 young men standing in front of a tall tree. One of them had a posture she would recognize anywhere. "That's my father," she said, stepping closer to the photo. Arthur stepped closer too, looked at the photo, and then looked at her. "George's son?" he asked. "Daughter," she said. He stared at her for a moment. Then he went to sit in a wooden chair by the stove and said, "It's been a long time since I've been waiting for someone to come talk about George." He told his story. He spoke in the slow voice of someone unearthing something that had been buried for a long time. He told about the time he and George had worked together on that land, about the agreements that had been made verbally with other property owners in the region, about the deed George had registered that everyone back then knew was legitimate. He told about George's final years, when his health declined, and the paperwork that should have been completed was put off, and the later never came. "I knew that land was George's," he said, "and I know it never left the family. I saw the documents he had. I was there when he registered it." "Would you be willing to put that in writing?" Chloe asked carefully. Arthur looked at her. Then he looked at Martha. And then he said, "If it's to do right by George's child, yes." Chloe closed her eyes for a second, breathing. Those were the words she needed to hear. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Arthur's testimony was formalized 4 days later at the city's county clerk's office with all the necessary signatures and notarizations. Chloe sent everything to James by message with photos, and the lawyer replied a few hours later with a single sentence, "Now we have what we needed." The formal process moved forward with a speed that surprised everyone, not because it was fast in an absolute sense, but because each step James presented faced less resistance than expected. The documents were clear. The testimonies were solid. The irregularity in the original property transfer was visible to anyone who read the records carefully. But Richard wasn't standing still. When he realized a lawyer was involved, that documents were being processed, and that Martha had been one of the pieces in that process, he panicked. Not the kind of panic that shows, the kind that stays inside and makes a man make wrong decisions, trying to save what's starting to slip through his fingers. He sought out people in the community who had connections with local authorities and tried to create formal obstacles. He claimed that access to the county clerk's office records had been irregular. He tried to question the validity of Arthur's testimony based on the man's age, suggesting he was no longer capable of being clear about the facts. These were maneuvers that James responded to with documentation and the coldness of someone used to playing that kind of game. But they took time, and the delay cost. Chloe had returned to the university after making sure the process was on track, but the following weeks were hard. She split her attention between classes and updates from James, slept poorly, and there was a constant pressure beneath everything she did that didn't go away even when she was sitting in a lecture. David, on this side, kept working on the hollow trunk. He kept improving the structure, adding details that made the space more functional, more dignified. He built a small shelf on the inside wall to store the few belongings he had. He made a simple system to hang the utensils Martha had been giving him over the days. A small pot, 2 metal cups, a wooden spoon. The relationship between David and Martha had changed without either of them putting it into words. She stopped by every morning with something, sometimes food, sometimes just to see how he was doing. And he stopped returning the containers and started returning her company instead, after a coffee he made on the stove. She would sit on the bench outside. He would sit at the entrance of the hollow trunk and they would talk. They were conversations about simple things, about the colder weather coming, about the trees the older pines had already survived, about the history of the region, which she knew better than any book could describe. But within these simple conversations, there was a layer of real human connection that David hadn't had in a long time. "Did you know your father planted some of the pines along this road?" she asked one afternoon. David looked at the pines. "I didn't know that." "He did. Back when this road was dirt and people still rode horses. He liked planting things. He said you plant something, knowing it will bear fruit for those who come after." David stared at the pines for a long time. "He was a good man," he said finally. "He was," Martha confirmed. "And you're like him. More stubborn, but similar." He let out a low laugh, the first one in a long time. And that small laugh was more important than it seemed. There was an afternoon, weeks after the start of the legal process, when everything seemed to be at a standstill. James was waiting for a response from a formal proceeding. Chloe was waiting for news from James. David was waiting for anything that would break that silence, which could be good or could be the prelude to bad news. It was that afternoon that Richard showed up. David Miller was outside the log cabin, chopping wood with an axe, when he saw the pickup truck stop on the road. He recognized that vehicle immediately. He stopped working, drove the axe into the stump, and waited. Richard Harrison got out of the truck with his hands in his pockets and walked through the snow with that posture of a man who wants to seem calm but isn't. He came to about 10 feet from David and stopped. "David," he said. "Richard," David replied. Nothing more. There was between them a kind of silence that wasn't empty. It was loaded with 15 years of partnership, of shared work, of lunches together, of decisions made with a handshake, and of a betrayal that had torn all of that apart at once. "I came to talk," Richard said. "I'm here." "This is getting too complicated for everyone." Richard looked at the log cabin, at the stacked firewood, at the chimney with smoke rising. "There's a simpler way out." "What way?" "You sign a document acknowledging that the property is mine without contest, and I'll pay you an amount that will set you up for a good while. You leave, start over somewhere else, and this story ends here." David listened to it all without moving. He kept his eyes on Richard the whole time, without looking away. "How long did it take you to put this scheme together?" he asked in a calm voice. Richard hadn't expected that question. "What?" "I asked how long you spent planning this, because it wasn't overnight. You waited for me to get sick, you waited for the right moment, and then you acted. That takes planning. I'm curious." "This isn't the time to—" "Because I spent 15 years trusting you," David continued, with the same calm, almost conversational voice. 15 years. I worked alongside you, I shared decisions with you, I made deals with a handshake, and while I was in a bed with a fever, you were at the county clerk's office, forging documents." Richard didn't answer. "So no," David said. "I'm not signing anything, I'm not taking your money, and I'm not leaving." "You won't win this," Richard said, and there was a controlled pressure in his voice. "Maybe," David said, "but even if you do win, you'll have to show every person in these parts what you did to get where you are, and that's already started." Richard stared at him for a long moment, and then he went back to the pickup truck. David stood still until the sound of the engine faded away. Then he pulled the axe from the stump, looked at the pile of wood that still needed to be chopped, and went back to work. But inside there was something trembling slightly. Not from fear, more like the tremor of a rope that's been stretched beyond its normal limit and is vibrating with the tension it's accumulated. He called Chloe Miller that night. "He came to offer me money to give up," he said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "And you?" I refused. "Dad, I was expecting you to argue about this." "I'm not going to argue," she said, "but I need you to let me know when he shows up again, okay?" "He'll show up again?" When people get desperate, they do the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. A pause. "I called James Patterson today. Things are moving. Another week, maybe 2. David was silent. "Chloe." "Yeah?" "Thank you." She took a second to respond. "You didn't have to," she said with a voice that was trying to be casual and not quite succeeding. "Yes, I did." They hung up. And the following week was perhaps the most tense of this whole story. James had formally filed the documents and the testimonies, and a date was set for a preliminary hearing. Richard was trying to block the proceedings through more formal objections, claiming that the documents from the county clerk's office had been obtained improperly, that Arthur Jenkins's testimony wasn't valid enough, that there were inconsistencies that needed to be checked. James answered every question with additional documentation. It was a duel of paperwork, slow and exasperating, where every advance from one side was followed by an obstacle from the other. David learned about all this movement through Chloe, who called every day, sometimes twice. The conversations were longer than they had been in months, and within them there was a gradual reconnection of the thread that had been cut between them. It wasn't a pretty process. There was one afternoon when the two argued on the phone about a strategic decision James had made that David disagreed with. His voice rose, her voice rose higher, and then they both fell silent for a few seconds before Chloe said, "Dad, you're not alone in this." And David replied, "I know." And that, in itself, was already a huge transformation. The turnaround no one expected came from a place no one had foreseen. There was a man in the community named Michael Foster, 55 years old, who worked as an accountant for several rural landowners in the Appalachian Mountains, and had a working relationship with Richard that went back years. Michael was a discreet man who did his job without making noise, and throughout this entire period he had stayed completely quiet. But Michael had seen things, not directly, but in numbers, in documents that had passed through his hands, in contracts he had helped draft. There were traces of irregularities he had chosen not to look at head-on because it was more comfortable that way. Until the story of Richard's confrontation with Mrs. Martha reached him through the same channels it reached everyone else. Michael went to James's office on his own, without anyone asking, without anyone knowing he had this information. What he handed over to the lawyer wasn't a testimony. It was a copy of a financial document from a transaction Richard had made during the time David was sick, a transaction that had passed through Michael's accounting books and showed a transfer of value inconsistent with what would be a legitimate deal. In other words, there was evidence that the process of tampering with the documents had involved a payment to someone, and that payment had left a trail. James looked at that document for a long time. Then he called Chloe. "The situation has changed," he said, "significantly." With Michael's material combined with the original documents from the county clerk's office and the testimonies from Mrs. Martha and Arthur, the picture was complete enough for the preliminary hearing to have a very different outcome than what Richard expected. The following week, the formal decision was communicated through James. David's eviction was invalid. The forged documents that transferred the property to Richard were formally challenged. And the specific area where the stump was located, confirmed as part of George Miller's inheritance by 2 independent testimonies and the original ownership record, legally returned to the family. It wasn't the total end of the dispute. Legal processes rarely were that clean, but it was enough for Richard to lose the ground beneath his feet, in the literal and figurative sense. Without support from any local authority, which already viewed him with suspicion after the episode with Mrs. Martha, and with the reputation he had built over years starting to crumble like a poorly built wall, Richard did what people do when they realize the game is over. He disappeared. His pickup truck was seen leaving town 2 days after the preliminary decision, loaded up, and it didn't come back. The property he had usurped remained in a pending legal situation that James would handle in the following weeks. But the man who had created that situation had gone away without giving anyone any satisfaction. On the day the decision was officially announced, David was at the entrance to the stump when Chloe arrived by car. She came down, walking through the snow with her coat buttoned up, and stopped beside him. The two of them stood looking at the trunk for a moment. Martha arrived a few minutes later on foot, with a steaming cup of tea balanced in her hands. She stood still next to the two of them. None of them said anything for a long while. It was one of those winter afternoons when the sun appears in a way that doesn't warm you, but lights things up in a way that's almost beautiful, casting a weak, honey-colored light over the snow and the dark bark of the trunk. The smoke rose thin from the makeshift chimney. The pile of firewood was neatly stacked to the side. The wooden door was open. "Are you going to build a real house now?" asked Martha. David kept staring at the trunk. "I am," he said, "but this one stays." "This trunk?" asked Chloe, with a smile at the corner of her mouth. "This trunk," he confirmed. "It stays exactly as it is." "Why?" asked Martha. David was silent for a moment before answering. "Because this is where I learned that it isn't the heat of the wood that keeps you standing. It's the courage to stay still when everything tells you to leave." Martha took a sip of the tea. Chloe looked at her father with an expression he couldn't quite read, but that seemed like pride. "Your grandfather would have liked you," said Martha, looking at Chloe. "He was stubborn too, but he knew when he was right." Chloe looked at the old lady. "Did you really know my grandfather?" "I worked alongside your grandfather's father's land for 5 years when I was younger." She paused briefly. "Your grandfather was a man who planted pine trees knowing he'd never see their shade. That says a lot about a person." The three of them stood looking at the surrounding pine trees. It was true. The pines were too tall to have been planted by anyone still alive. In the following months, life slowly rebuilt itself, as true rebuilding requires. James finished the remaining legal procedures. The property returned to David's name through the recognition of George Miller's inheritance, and the additional lawsuit against the forged documents proceeded with Michael's documentation as the centerpiece. David began construction on the house in April, when the cold had let up enough for foundation work to be possible. He hired 2 men from the area he had known for years, men who had heard the whole story and showed up with tools and without needing any explanation. Construction moved slowly because David didn't have the resources to rush anything, but it progressed with a quality that was visible in every part. Chloe applied for a transfer to a closer university and was accepted. She started visiting him every weekend, sometimes arriving Friday night, sometimes early Saturday. They gradually picked up the conversation they had lost, not all at once, but little by little, as if they were reassembling something that had broken into many pieces and couldn't be rushed. There was one afternoon when she was sitting inside the trunk while he worked outside, and she asked, without any particular reason, "Dad, have you ever regretted coming here, to this region, I mean?" He stopped working. He thought for a moment. "No," he said, "never. This land is mine. It's our family's. It was Grandpa George's. It will be mine. It will be yours if you want it one day." "I don't know if I want to live here forever," she said honestly. "You don't have to live here forever," he said, "but it's good to know it'll be here when you want it." She thought about that for a while. "Did you know Arthur asked about you?" she said after a moment. "Mrs. Martha told me. He said he wanted to see you in person one day." "I'll visit him," said David. "I should have visited a long time ago." "Why didn't you?" "Because I'm stubborn." She laughed. "At least you admit it." "I'm getting better," and he was. You could see it in the way he had started to respond when someone helped him, without making a gesture to give back or refuse, in the way he greeted Martha in the morning with coffee ready instead of waiting for her to show up, in the way he called Chloe one night just to ask how she was, with no specific reason, no problem to solve. They were small things, but they were things he hadn't done before. Martha, for her part, gradually became a constant presence in that story, in a way no one had planned, but that felt right. She'd show up in the morning, stay for a while, then go back home. Sometimes David would go to her property to help with something she needed, something she'd never have asked for directly, but that he had learned to pick up on without her saying a word. There was a simple reciprocity to it, the kind older folks understand better than anyone. You take care of someone, not because you have to, but because that's how things work when they still work right. There was something that stayed with David for a long time after everything was settled, a question he kept turning over in his head without a perfect answer. It was about Richard. Not about what Richard had done, but about what David hadn't seen. Why had he trusted a man that, over time, his daughter had been suspicious of from the start? What had made him blind to that? Late one afternoon, as he sat outside the trunk, looking at the horizon with the fire burning inside and the smoke coming out of the chimney, he spoke to Martha about it. "I wanted to believe he was honest," he said, after a silence she had waited for patiently, "because believing he was dishonest would mean I had to admit I made a bad choice, and I didn't like admitting I was wrong." Martha was quiet for a moment. "Pride," she said simply. "Pride," he confirmed. "Pride protects us from a lot of things that don't need protecting," she said with the calm tone of someone speaking from hard-earned experience. "And it leaves out exactly the thing that needs to come in." David nodded. "Chloe saw it right away," he said. "From the start. Because she had nothing to protect. Young kid, clear eyes. She's not a kid anymore." "No, but she still has clear eyes." Martha paused briefly. "And you will too now, after all this." He kept staring at the smoke rising thin through the metal pipe. "I hope so," he said. The house was finished at the start of the following autumn, months later. It was a simple construction, a mix of wood and brick, with a porch out front and windows that caught the afternoon light. Small, but solid, the kind that lasts. On the day he officially moved in, he carefully took his belongings out of the trunk one by one. The small pot, the 2 metal cups, the wooden spoon, the old blanket which he folded and stored on a shelf in the house because he couldn't bring himself to throw it away, the worn-out backpack he'd had since the beginning, and that was the last time he slept in the trunk. But the trunk stayed, exactly where it was, with the makeshift chimney still on top, with the wooden door fitted precisely into place. David ran a hand over the thick bark before closing the door one last time, with a care that an outsider might find odd, but that made perfect sense to him. That trunk had been the only solid thing the world had offered him at a time when everything else had disappeared, and he didn't forget that. Chloe took a photo that afternoon, David standing at the entrance of the trunk, wearing the same green jacket he'd had from the start, his shoulders a little less hunched than in the photo that had become talk of the community months earlier. His eyes had the same steadiness as always, but with something else in them that was harder to name. The photo made its rounds, this time with a different meaning. It wasn't the story of a man who had lost everything. It was the story of a man who had found something he didn't know he was missing. Arthur Jenkins came to visit the new property on a Saturday in October, brought by Martha. It was the first time he had left the house in months, and he said it without complaint, simply as a fact. He walked around the land in silence, looking at the trees, at the new house, at the tree trunk that was still standing. When he reached the trunk, he stood in front of it for a while. "Your father would have done the same thing," he said without looking at David. "Live inside a tree?" asked David with a smile. "Stay," said Arthur. "When everything told you to leave, stay." They were silent for a moment. "You played a big part in this," said David. "You didn't have to do what you did." Arthur looked at him sideways. "I did what was right," he said simply. "The same thing you did." They had lunch together that afternoon, the 4 of them on the porch of the new house. Martha had brought enough food for twice the number of people present as always. Chloe had arrived early and helped organize. Arthur ate in silence but with appetite. And David, sitting at the head of a table he had built with his own hands, looked at those 3 people around him and thought he had arrived at a place that no document from the county clerk's office could describe. It wasn't the land. It wasn't the house. It wasn't anything measured in meters or dollars. It was this table, this lunch, these people. Winter came back the following month, earlier than expected, as it almost always did in that region. The snow covered the road, covered the trunk, covered the pile of firewood that David had already prepared weeks before, in enough quantity for both of them, for him and for Martha, because he had promised her, on that day when he first accepted soup in her kitchen, that there would never be a shortage of firewood for her stove during the winter. And he kept what he promised. On the first night of heavy snow, sitting by the stove in the new house with a coffee in his hand, and the wind beating against the windows outside, David listened to the sound of the wind and thought about how different it was now. The same wind, the same snow, the same cold. But on this side of the wall, inside this house he had built with his own hands on this land that belonged to his father's father, the sound wasn't a threat. It was just winter doing what winter always did. That same night, Chloe called at 9 o'clock, as she had started doing since she moved to the new city. "It's snowing here too," she said. "It's heavy here," he said. "Enough firewood?" "I have an electric heater, Dad. I don't need firewood." "But do you have any?" she laughed. "I have firewood, I have a heater, I have food, I have everything. Don't worry." He felt at ease, or at least he did the best he could, which was already much better than before. "How's university?" "Tiring, but good." A pause. "You know what's funny? I started telling people at university about the tree trunk, about what you built. And they don't believe it." She paused briefly. "But they want to see a picture." "I don't have a picture." "The one I took the other day. You're in it, the trunk is behind you. It looks like it came out of a book." David was silent for a moment. "Don't show it. No need." "Why not? You should be proud of what you did there." "I am proud," he said. "But it doesn't need to become a story for strangers." Chloe was quiet for a moment. "It's already a story, Dad," she said, with a voice that was both gentle and firm. "It is for me. It is for Mrs. Martha. It is for Arthur. It is for everyone in this region who thought you were brave while Richard tried to make everyone think you were ridiculous." David drank the coffee in his hand. "People thought I was brave. A lot of people. You didn't know because you stayed in the tree trunk without talking to anyone. But the conversations in the groups, the ones Mrs. Martha showed me later, weren't all mockery. There were plenty of people who admired you, who said you hadn't left, that you had stayed." He fell silent. It was information he hadn't known, something that shifted a small part of how he saw those months. Not much, but a little. "Good night, Dad," said Chloe after a while. "Good night," he said. "Take care of yourself." "I will. You take care too." "I will." He hung up. He stared at the fire in the stove for a moment. Then he went to the window and looked at the snow falling outside, covering the yard, covering the woodpile, covering the giant tree trunk that sat at a distance he could make out even in the darkness of a winter night. The chimney of the trunk no longer had smoke. There was no more fire inside. But the trunk stood upright, covered in snow, with its wooden door closed like something that stayed because it was built to stay. David stared at it for a long time. There was something about that tree trunk that he couldn't quite explain to anyone, the reason he would never tear it down. It wasn't sentimentality. It was something more practical than that. It was the fact that that trunk had been proof that when there's nothing left, it's still possible to build something. Not out of nothing, with what you have, with what the world left there, with the old wood, with the rusty nails, with the hands that still worked. And it was good to have that visible proof out there under the snow for the days when he forgot, because we all forget at some point how much we are capable of enduring. And to have something outside that reminds you of that, something that stood where it had reason to fall, is one of the most honest ways the world has of telling us we are stronger than we think. And he was inside. End of the story. This was a story that reminds us that the greatest building a human being can make is not of wood or stone. Tell us in the comments what you felt, where you're watching us from, and whether you believe David made the right choice in refusing Richard's money. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and see you in the next story.